It was Tuesday, late morning. I remember because I had just poured myself a second cup of coffee, sat down in the sunroom, and opened my crossword book. The house was quiet, the way it always is now. No ticking clocks, no footsteps upstairs, no voices from another room. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards adjusting to the sun. And then the phone rang. I looked at the screen. Elizabeth. My daughter. I hadn't heard from her in 2 weeks, not since that rushed voicemail on her way to the airport. I smiled, straightened my back, and answered with a cheerful, "Elizabeth, sweetheart." She interrupted me. "Martha, we need to talk." Martha. She rarely called me that. Not Mom, not Mother, just Martha. My heart sank a little, but I stayed quiet. "We've gone over everything," she continued, her voice flat, matter of fact, like she was reading from a script. "James and I spoke with the realtor. The papers are in motion. The house will be sold by the end of next month." I froze. "I'm sorry. What do you mean, sold?" "Your house, Mother. It's time. It's too much space for you. You're alone. The stairs are dangerous, and honestly, it's not practical anymore. We've found you a lovely condo in Rosegate Residence. It's 1 floor, central air, on-site nurses." "Wait, Elizabeth, you can't just—" "We already have, Mother," she said, cutting me off again. "You'll be safer there, less to manage. You don't drive anymore, you barely leave the house. This will be good for you." I stood up without realizing, the phone trembling in my hand. My legs suddenly felt too thin to carry me. "You didn't even ask me," I whispered. "We didn't need to. You're not in the position to make decisions like this, not anymore. James and I are your children. We're responsible for you now." I couldn't breathe. "You'll thank us later," she said. "The move will be in 3 weeks. The realtor will contact you about showings. Please keep the house tidy." There was a silence. I could hear my own heartbeat. "I have to go," she added. "Meeting in 10. Just try not to make this harder than it needs to be." Then, a click, and the line went dead. I stared at the phone, at my hand, at the floor. I didn't sit. I didn't cry. I just stood there, the sound of that click echoing louder than anything in the house. My children had sold my life, without asking me. And somehow, they thought they were doing me a favor. My name is Martha Cole, and I am 67 years old. I have lived in this house for 42 of them. I was a librarian for most of my working life. The kind of librarian who knew exactly where every book belonged, who could recommend you the perfect novel for a rainy afternoon, and who always remembered your name. I loved my job. I loved the quiet order of it, the sense that there was a place for everything, and everyone. I've been a widow for 11 years. My husband, Daniel, was an English teacher, a kind man with a patient smile and the kind of voice that could make Shakespeare feel like a bedtime story. He died of a heart attack one Saturday morning while fixing the kitchen sink. I was standing right here, at this very counter making tea. One moment he was humming to himself, the next, he was gone. Just like that. Life stopped making sense that day, but I kept moving. You keep moving because you have to. I have 2 children, Elizabeth and James. They are both in their 40s now. They live their own busy lives full of deadlines and flights and weekend plans. They call when they remember, visit when they have time. I've learned not to expect much. It hurts less that way. I have always been agreeable. That's the word. I don't raise my voice. I don't demand. I don't argue, even when I should. I smooth things over. I smile and say, "It's fine," when it isn't. I suppose part of me believed that being easy to live with, easy to love, would keep people close. That if I didn't cause trouble, no one would leave. And maybe that worked for a while. Maybe it kept the peace. But peace is not the same as love. And silence can be the heaviest thing you carry. This house, it is old, yes. The wallpaper in the hallway is faded. The wood floors have scratches from Daniel's chair, from the kids running down the hall with their socks on. The garden out back is more wild than I can manage these days, but it still blooms in the spring, stubborn and beautiful. It is my home. My history is in these walls. Every corner whispers a memory. And yet, in one phone call, my children decided it was time to erase all of that. To tidy me away, like an old book nobody reads anymore. They think they're protecting me, but they don't understand. You can't protect someone by stripping them of everything that makes them who they are. I have been quiet for too long. And maybe it's time I learn to speak. They came on a Sunday afternoon. Elizabeth in her crisp white blouse, James in a polo shirt that still smelled faintly of cologne. They didn't sit long. They didn't need to. They were here on a mission, and missions don't leave room for tea or small talk. They walked through my house like inspectors, opening doors, peeking into closets, making little notes on their phones. I followed them from room to room, my hands clasped in front of me, not sure whether I was supposed to speak or just watch. Elizabeth paused in the living room, eyes moving over the old oak bookshelves Daniel built. "We'll need to have these taken out," she said. "Too heavy, too dated." James was in the kitchen already, measuring the counters. "Potential buyers like open space. This wall should go." They spoke to each other more than to me, like I was a tenant they needed to notify, not the woman who had lived here for most of her life. I tried once to remind them of the memories in this house. "Your father painted this room himself, remember? The summer you broke your arm, James, and we—" Elizabeth cut in without looking at me. "We're not here to reminisce, Mother. Let's stay focused." An hour later, they were at the front door, slipping on their shoes. Elizabeth gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, already glancing at her watch. "We'll be in touch about the timeline," she said. James added, "Start sorting your things. Just keep what you really need." Then the door closed behind them. And just like that, silence. Not the gentle, companionable silence I used to love when Daniel and I would sit reading in the same room. This was different. Heavy. Hollow. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the emptiness they'd left behind. It was as if their voices had scraped something out of the walls. I wandered through the house after they left, touching the backs of chairs, the cool banister of the staircase, the frame of the kitchen doorway. My own home suddenly felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else now and I was trespassing. Even the air felt unsettled, disturbed. I ended up in the sunroom, where the light was starting to fade. Outside, the garden swayed in the late breeze, wild and stubborn as ever. But inside, I felt small, like a shadow moving through rooms that no longer recognized me. It is a strange thing, to be in the place you know best, surrounded by everything that tells your story, and to feel like you've already been written out of it. It was last spring, my 67th birthday. I had decided a week in advance that I would try again. One more effort to gather them, to have everyone under one roof, to feel like a family. I told Elizabeth and James about it 2 weeks before so they'd have time. "Just a simple dinner," I said on the phone. "I'll make your favourites." Elizabeth hesitated, then said she'd check the calendar. James mumbled something about the kids' sports schedules, but neither of them said no outright, so I let myself hope. I went to the market the day before, bought the good cheese Daniel used to love, fresh herbs for the roast chicken, the cake ingredients, chocolate and raspberries, just the way Elizabeth used to request. I ironed the tablecloth, polished the old silver, and arranged flowers from my own garden in a wide, low vase so everyone could see each other across the table. That morning, I woke early. I put the chicken in to marinate, baked the cake, set the table. The house smelled warm and alive, like it used to when birthdays meant laughter and wrapping paper and too many people squeezed into the kitchen. I wore my blue dress, the one Daniel said made my eyes look like summer skies. By 5 o'clock, everything was ready. I checked the clock, checked my phone. 6 came. 7. No car in the driveway. No knock at the door. I told myself maybe they were running late. Traffic, a last-minute stop for flowers, something. By 8, the chicken was cold, the candles had burned down to little stubs, and my phone lit up. One message. From Elizabeth. Happy birthday, Mother. Sorry we couldn't make it. James had a work thing and the kids were tired. We'll celebrate another time. Another time. Those 2 words felt like a joke. I sat at the table for a while, staring at the plates I'd set out for people who were never coming. The flowers leaned toward the melted candles, the silver catching the last light from the window. I didn't cry right away, I just sat there, feeling my chest go tight, my hands heavy in my lap. It hit me then, harder than I expected, that my birthdays weren't on anyone's calendar but my own, that I could spend the rest of my life setting tables no one would sit at, making dinners no one would eat. And I realized, maybe it was time to stop asking for a place at a table where I wasn't wanted. It was a week after that birthday when I found myself in the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. Too much dust, too many boxes of things I wasn't ready to look at. But something drew me up the narrow stairs that afternoon, maybe the way the sunlight was cutting across the landing, like an invitation. The air was warm and dry, carrying that old smell of cedar and paper. I brushed past a stack of boxes marked Winter and Christmas until I reached one in the far corner, taped but not sealed. I recognized Daniel's handwriting on the side. Martha. Personal. I pulled it toward me, sat cross-legged on the wooden floor and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs I hadn't seen in decades. Me in my 20s with hair down my back, Daniel holding Elizabeth as a newborn, James on his first day of school with a backpack too big for him. Beneath the photos wrapped in tissue paper was a worn leather journal. The sight of it made my throat tighten. I knew this journal. Daniel kept it for years, jotting down thoughts late at night when he couldn't sleep. I opened it carefully, the spine creaking. His handwriting leaned slightly to the right, always neat, always deliberate. I turned a few pages at random. Notes about his classes, the garden, a new recipe he wanted to try. Then I found a page dated March 14th, 1998, my birthday that year. Martha doesn't see herself the way I do, it began. She thinks she's just keeping the house running. But she's holding all of us together. She's the quiet force that makes this family a family. I wish she knew how proud I am of her. My eyes blurred, but I kept reading. Another entry from years later. She lets people step over her sometimes. She calls it keeping the peace. I call it giving away pieces of herself. I hope one day she remembers she has the right to stand tall, even against those she loves. There were letters too, folded between the pages, little notes he'd written but never given me. One read, "If anyone ever makes you feel small, even if it's our own children, promise me you won't believe them. You are more than they will ever know." I sat there in the dust and the fading light, holding his words like something fragile and alive. It struck me that Daniel had seen me more clearly than I'd ever seen myself. And maybe it wasn't too late to start seeing what he saw. I closed the journal, but the words stayed open inside me. Dorothy showed up on my doorstep 2 days later, carrying a lemon cake the size of a small planet. She didn't call first. She never does. "I was in the mood to bake," she said, brushing past me into the kitchen. "And I know you won't make this for yourself because you're too busy eating those sad little crackers for lunch." I set the kettle on while she unpacked the cake, humming like she owned the place. Dorothy has been my friend since we were 21. She knows every version of me. The shy librarian, the new wife, the nervous young mother, the widow who forgot how to laugh. And she has never been afraid to tell me the truth, even when it's sharp. We sat at the table, the lemon scent filling the room. She took a forkful, sighed in approval, then fixed me with that look, the one that makes me feel like a student about to be scolded. "All right, Martha," she said. "Tell me what's going on. You've got that face." I hesitated, then told her about Elizabeth's phone call, about the Sunday visit, about the decision they'd made without me. I didn't mean to, but my voice shook a little when I said, "They think they're helping." Dorothy put down her fork. "Helping? Darling, they're packing you up like you're a piece of furniture they've outgrown." I almost laughed. The image was so absurd, but the sting of it kept me still. "They're my children," I said quietly as if that explained anything. "And?" Dorothy leaned forward. "So they get a free pass to treat you like you don't exist? Let me tell you something, my dear. If you keep being convenient, they'll keep using you as a convenience. You've made yourself so easy, so undemanding, that they forget you're a person." I tried to smile, but she wasn't finished. "You've spent your life making sure no one is uncomfortable around you." "But what about you, Martha? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be uncomfortable for your own sake? When was the last time you said, 'No, I don't agree'?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I couldn't remember. Dorothy reached across the table and patted my hand. "You're not a chair, Martha. You're not here to be sat on and ignored. And if you're afraid of becoming inconvenient, maybe it's because deep down, you know it's the only way they'll see you again." The kettle whistled. I poured the tea, the steam curling between us. Her words stayed in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark, small but real, of wanting to prove her right. It took me 3 days to gather the courage. 3 days of walking past the phone, of thinking, "No, not today, tomorrow," and then pretending I had something more important to do. But on the morning of the 4th day, I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, and I dialed the number. The receptionist answered, polite but brisk, and I gave my name. There was a pause, then a surprised warmth in her tone. "Oh, Martha. Mr. Bennett will be so pleased to hear from you. Hold on just a moment." A click, and then that familiar gravelly voice. Older now, but still steady. "Martha Dawson. Now there's a name I haven't heard in far too long." I smiled in spite of myself. "Hello, Thomas. It's been, what, 15 years?" "16, he corrected. "Last time we spoke, you were settling Frank's affairs. How have you been?" How had I been? That was a question too big to answer, so I said simply, "Managing. But I need your help again." He listened while I told him about the call from Elizabeth, about Michael's silent agreement, about their decision to sell the house. My voice was quiet, but each word felt like it carried a little more weight than the last. When I finished, there was a pause. Then Thomas said, "And you want to change your will?" "Yes," I said. "I want it entirely rewritten. No loopholes, no ambiguity." His voice softened. "You know, Martha, most people don't make a move like this until it's too late. I've seen too many clients cry in my office because they waited for an apology that never came. You're doing this while you can still choose." A small shiver went through me, part fear, part relief. "Will you help me?" "Of course, but Martha, be prepared. If your children find out, they won't take it kindly." I know. My fingers were cold around the coffee mug. I'm tired of being kind for everyone else's comfort. We set an appointment for the following Tuesday. After I hung up, the house felt strangely alive, as if it had heard me and was holding its breath. I walked from room to room, touching the edges of old photographs, the arm of Frank's chair, the smooth wood of the banister. It wasn't just paper I was changing. It was the story of who I was and who I refused to be anymore. And somewhere, deep under the years of silence, a voice in me whispered, "Finally." I sat on the porch that afternoon, a thin blanket over my knees, the air smelling faintly of rain. The lawyer's appointment was still days away, but my mind wouldn't stop turning. I kept hearing Thomas's words, "You're doing this while you can still choose." And it made me think of all the choices I used to make for myself, before I became only Mum. I wasn't always this quiet woman who lived in the shadow of her own life. Once I was Martha Dawson, the girl who stayed up all night in the university library, losing herself in books until the sun came up over the river. I studied English literature and philosophy, not because it was practical, but because it filled me with something fierce and alive. I wrote essays that made my professors lean back in their chairs and say, "You have a mind that doesn't quit." Before I had children, I travelled. Not far, but enough to taste the world. A weekend in Boston, a month in Edinburgh on a student exchange, afternoons in little cafes where I would fill my journal with sketches of strangers and scraps of overheard conversations. I wore my hair long then, and I laughed loudly, with my whole body. I was in love with Frank, and he was in love with me, and we believed, with the arrogance of the young, that we could survive anything. And then, of course, the babies came. Elizabeth first, then Michael 2 years later. My world narrowed overnight. I folded away my journals and my university notes. I learned to pack lunches, to budget for shoes they would outgrow in 6 months, to keep my voice gentle even when I wanted to scream. I told myself that this was what love looked like. Giving, giving, until there was nothing left to give. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being Martha. I became Mom, and later Grandma. A title, not a person. My books gathered dust. My curiosity atrophied. My life became a series of tasks. Cooking, cleaning, waiting. Always waiting for the call, the visit, the moment they might remember I was more than a background figure in their lives. But as I sat there on the porch, I realized something. I am still the woman who once walked through the streets of Edinburgh in the rain, tasting freedom on my tongue. I am still the girl who filled her journals with dreams too big for one lifetime. That part of me didn't die. It just went quiet, waiting for me to call her back. And I decided, I will call her back. I will be more than a mother again. The lake house had been sitting empty for years except for the occasional weekend when I went there alone with a thermos of tea and a stack of books. I would unlock the door, step into the stale, quiet air, and almost hear the echoes of a life that never happened. I had pictured my grandchildren running barefoot on the dock, Frank teaching them how to bait a hook, laughter spilling over the water. But those summers never came. Elizabeth and Michael were always too busy. Work, school, vacations that didn't include me. The last time any of them saw the lake house was over 7 years ago, when Michael stopped by for exactly 2 hours on his way to a conference. He sat on the porch scrolling through his phone while I tried to make small talk about the loons nesting across the bay. I remember feeling as though I were talking to someone through glass. My words couldn't reach him. The house itself had grown tired. The paint was peeling, the dock sagged on one side, and the garden Frank once tended had turned into a wild tangle. I used to think I would fix it up, maybe rent it out, maybe wait until the family suddenly realized how precious it was. But that day never came, and the longer I waited, the heavier it felt. It was as if the lake house had become a monument to promises that were never kept. One rainy afternoon, I stood in the living room of that house looking out at the water, and I said out loud, "It's time." My voice sounded strange in the empty room, but it was steady. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the sharp sadness I expected. Instead, there was a quiet relief, like loosening a knot that had been pulling for years. The realtor came the following week. She was younger than my daughter, with quick eyes that scanned every corner. "It's a beautiful spot," she said. "This will sell quickly." I nodded, signing the papers without hesitation. Part of me thought about calling Elizabeth and Michael to tell them, but I knew exactly how that conversation would go. Polite surprise, maybe a hint of annoyance, but no real interest. So I didn't. When the offer came in, higher than I had dared to hope, I accepted immediately. I walked down to the dock one last time, the boards soft under my feet, and let the wind tangle my hair. The water was still, a mirror reflecting the grey sky. I whispered goodbye, not to the house, but to the version of myself who had been waiting there all these years. She didn't need to wait anymore. When I stepped into Mr. Harris's office, the familiar scent of polished wood and old paper hit me like a wave. I had not been there in over a decade, not since Frank's passing, when we'd finalised the old will. Back then, everything had gone to the children, as though the future we'd dreamed of for them was certain and safe. That certainty had long since eroded. Mr. Harris stood as I entered, his silver hair catching the morning light. "Martha," he said warmly, "it's been too long." I smiled, though my stomach twisted. "I need to make changes," I told him. "Big ones." He listened without interrupting as I explained. The neglect, the casual cruelty, the way my life had been reduced to something they occasionally remembered when it was convenient. His pen rested on the desk, unmoving as if he knew the weight of what I was about to ask. When I finally said, "I want to leave them nothing," he only raised one eyebrow. "You're certain?" he asked. "Once this is done, it's done, and it will make waves." "I'm certain," I replied. "Everything goes to charity, half to the Lakeview Literacy Fund. Frank loved the idea of more people discovering books, and the other half to the community library and the senior arts program. I want something of mine to matter to people who actually care." Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, studying me with a look I couldn't quite read. "You know," he said slowly, "most people who sit in that chair and say those words, they're angry, bitter. You're not. You just seem free." "I feel free," I admitted. And it was true. The moment I spoke the words out loud, something shifted in me. For so long I had been tethered to the hope that my children would change, that they would see me, not as a burden, not as a piece of furniture in the background, but as their mother. Letting go of that hope was like unclenching a fist that had been cramped for years. We went through the documents together, my name flowing into new sentences that cut ties as neatly as a blade. He added a clause to disinherit anyone who tried to contest the will, smiling faintly as he slid the paper toward me. "This," he said, "will keep you safe." I signed each page with a steady hand. When it was over, I felt lighter, as if I had taken back a part of myself I hadn't realized was missing. Walking out into the bright afternoon, I didn't think about the storm this would cause. I thought about the shelves of books at the library, the children curled up with them, the older folks painting in the sunlit community room. My legacy would be theirs. And for the first time in years, that thought made me smile. The idea came to me one quiet morning over tea. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. More like a performance. One last act where I would finally hold the stage, where the lines would be mine and I would deliver them without trembling. I decided to invite the children to dinner and make it sound like a gesture of peace, a reconciliation, the sort of word that makes people lean in and hope. I called Anna first. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. "Hello, Mother." I kept my tone warm, measured. "I've been thinking about how far we've drifted. I'd like to have you and your brother over this Sunday. Just us, dinner at the house. I want to talk, clear the air." There was a pause long enough for me to hear the clock ticking in the hall. "All right," she said at last. "We'll come." When I hung up, I immediately called Dorothy. She didn't even let me finish before exclaiming, "Oh, Martha! This is it! The day you take the leading role!" She was at my door within the hour, armed with a notebook for the menu, and that mischievous sparkle in her eyes. We planned it like a wedding and a battle combined. Roast chicken with lemon and thyme, my mother's potato gratin, fresh green beans, homemade rolls, and, for dessert, Dorothy's lemon cake, the one so rich and fragrant it could silence a room. On Saturday, we shopped together, moving through the market like conspirators. She teased me over the parsley, saying, "This is going to be the dinner they remember for the rest of their lives." I knew she was right, but it wasn't the food they'd remember. That afternoon, she stayed to polish the silver while I ironed the white tablecloth Frank and I had received on our wedding day. Every motion felt deliberate, charged. I set out the crystal glasses, placed fresh flowers in the center of the table. By the time evening fell, the dining room looked like a photograph from a life I'd once had. Orderly, elegant, full of quiet promise. "This isn't just a meal," Dorothy said as she tied her apron. "This is your scene. You've rehearsed for it your whole life. You just didn't know it." I looked around the room, the soft light, the gleam of the china, the comforting aroma drifting from the oven. I thought of the years I had spent waiting for them to treat me with respect, to see me, to hear me. Sunday evening, I would no longer wait. I would speak, and they would listen. For once, the script was mine. They arrived at 6 sharp, as if punctuality could disguise the tension they carried in with their polished shoes and carefully chosen clothes. I met them at the door with a smile that felt steady, though my heart was beating like a drum. Anna kissed my cheek lightly, avoiding my eyes. David gave a stiff nod. The grandchildren mumbled greetings, already glancing toward the dining room. "Come in," I said warmly, stepping aside. "Dinner is ready." My voice was calm, almost gentle, but inside I felt like I was walking a tightrope in a still wind, waiting for the moment to leap. We gathered around the table. The china gleamed, the flowers glowed in the candlelight, and the air was filled with the rich scent of roast chicken and thyme. I carved, I poured, I asked about work, about school, about the weather. They responded with polite sentences, like strangers trying to endure a train ride together. We all knew the meal was an overture, the conversation just a soft drum roll before the main event. Halfway through, Anna set down her fork and asked, "Mother, you said you had something to discuss." Her tone was sugar with a thin crack of glass underneath. I dabbed my mouth with my napkin and looked at each of them in turn. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I do." I told them who I was. Not just their mother, but Martha Evelyn Carter, a woman who had lived, loved, and worked long before they were born. I spoke of the life I'd built, of the respect I'd given freely and the silence I'd endured too long. My words flowed without bitterness, but with weight, like stones laid one by one on a foundation I was reclaiming. David shifted in his seat. "Mother," he began, but I raised my hand. "Please let me finish." And then I told them about the will, about how, after years of being treated as if I were a burden or a placeholder, I had decided my estate would go elsewhere, to causes that had brought me joy and purpose, not to them, not anymore. The air seemed to thicken. Anna's face drained of colour, David's jaw tightened, the children froze, forks hovering over plates. But I kept speaking. I explained that it wasn't about punishment, but about dignity, about choosing, finally, to honour myself. When I finished, the room was silent except for the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. I reached for my glass of water, my hands steady. For the first time in years, I felt taller, lighter. Whatever storm was about to break, I was ready to stand in the rain. It was David who broke the silence first. His chair scraped back against the floor, the sound sharp as a blade. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice low at first, then rising. "That's our inheritance. Dad would have wanted it to stay in the family." Anna's eyes flashed, her voice trembling with outrage. "After everything we've done for you—" She stopped herself, perhaps realizing how empty that phrase would sound in the light of truth. "You're being cruel, Mother, vindictive." I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap. Cruel would have been letting this go on without saying what I needed to say. Vindictive would have been holding on to resentment in silence. What I'm doing is freeing myself. David's face darkened. "You think you can just give away what we've worked for?" His words struck me like a slap, not because of their sting, but because of how little he understood. "You worked for?" I repeated quietly, my eyes steady on his. "No, David. I worked. Your father worked. You've received more than you realize. Every holiday I hosted, every bill I helped cover, every time I swallowed my hurt instead of speaking. That silence was my gift to you. My silence was wealth, and you've spent every bit of it. Anna's hands clenched on the tablecloth. If you think we'll accept this, you're mistaken. We can go to court. We can prove... She stopped, as though the next words were poison in her mouth. I shook my head. You can try, but the will is airtight. I've had it checked and double-checked. This isn't a decision made in anger. It's been years in the making. The grandchildren sat frozen, eyes darting between their parents and me, as if watching a storm roll over the ocean. David's voice turned hard, almost cold. If you go through with this, you'll regret it. You'll die alone. I felt something in me, not break, but shift, like a door closing for the last time. David, I said softly, I have been alone for a very long time. This changes nothing. They kept talking, accusations tumbling over each other, threats disguised as pleas, the occasional sharp edge of guilt thrown like a stone. But it no longer touched me. I watched their faces, once so familiar, now contorted with greed and wounded entitlement. And I thought of my husband's words in that old journal. Don't let them trample you, even if they're family. When the shouting finally dulled into heavy breathing and narrowed eyes, I stood. Dinner is over, I said. You know where the door is. And for the first time in decades, I meant it. They all rose at once, the scrape of chairs and the rustle of coats filling the room like a tide pulling back. David was muttering under his breath. Anna's heels struck sharp notes against the hardwood floor, the grandchildren trailing behind them like shadows. I stayed seated, watching the scene without trying to stop it. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had settled into a strange, steady beat. As they moved toward the door, Fletcher lingered. He was taller than I remembered, the boyishness of his face starting to give way to something older, quieter. He didn't look at his parents. Instead, his eyes found mine. There was no anger there, no judgment, just a kind of searching. I gave him a small nod, an unspoken invitation to speak if he wanted. He took a step closer, keeping his voice low as if he didn't want the others to hear. I wasn't laughing that day, Grandma, he said. At your birthday, I didn't know what to do. The words landed gently, but they shook something loose inside me. For months, years maybe, I'd convinced myself that none of them cared, that every smile was mockery and every silence was agreement. But here was my grandson, telling me he'd been lost in it all, just as I had. I believe you, I told him, my voice soft. I could feel the sting in my eyes, but I didn't let the tears fall. Sometimes, Fletcher, it's hard to stand apart from the people around you, especially when they're the ones you love. He glanced toward the doorway where his parents were waiting, Anna shooting impatient looks over her shoulder. I don't like how they talk to you, he murmured. I never have. But I don't know how to fix it. I reached out, resting my hand lightly on his arm. It's not your job to fix it, I said. It's your job to decide what kind of person you want to be, and that's something only you can do. For a moment, we just stood there, two people in the eye of a storm. I saw the flicker of a smile in his eyes. Not happiness exactly, but maybe recognition, maybe hope. Goodbye, Grandma, he said finally, backing away toward the hallway. I watched him go, his shoulders straight despite the weight of the family he was following. At the door, he turned once more, a small wave, then gone. When the house was quiet again, I sat back down at the table, staring at the empty chairs. It had been a night of endings, but maybe, just maybe, Fletcher had left me a thread of something that could be a beginning. The morning I left, the sky was the pale blue of a well-worn quilt, the kind my mother used to pull over me on cold nights. The moving truck had gone ahead the day before, carrying what little I'd chosen to take, boxes of books, a few framed photographs, the old oak desk Frank had once repaired for me with his own hands. The rest I'd given away, sold or left behind like shed skin. Dorothy was already in the car when I stepped out, her hands wrapped around a travel mug, steam curling in the chill. "Ready?" she asked, her voice light but her eyes searching. I nodded, though the word felt heavier than it should. We slid into the seats and she started the engine. As we rolled down the driveway, I kept my eyes forward, until the very end. Then, in the mirror, I saw it. The house. My house. The brick looked a little more faded than I remembered, the shutters slightly askew. It had been my fortress, my prison, my stage, my refuge, and now it was just a building. 4 walls holding decades of laughter and silence, arguments and reconciliations, births and birthdays that never came. I felt no sudden surge of regret, no desperate urge to turn back. Just a calm acknowledgement. This chapter was over. The tyres crunched over the gravel as we reached the street, and for the first time in years, I realised I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology, not for an invitation, not for someone else to decide the shape of my days. I was moving. I was going. We drove through streets I knew like the lines on my own palm. The bakery where Frank and I had bought our first anniversary cake. The library steps where I'd once sat with a sandwich, reading in the sun during lunch breaks. Each landmark drifted past like old friends I wouldn't see again, and I sent them silent farewells. Beyond the town limits, the road stretched open, a long ribbon pulling us towards something unknown. The air smelled of autumn, crisp and faintly sweet. Dorothy hummed along with the radio, glancing at me from time to time, but she didn't fill the silence. She knew I needed it. In that quiet, my mind didn't circle back to what I'd lost. It lingered on what I might yet find, a home by the sea, mornings with the scent of salt air, evenings on a porch with a book and no clock to answer to. As the miles slipped by, the house in the mirror grew smaller, then vanished altogether. My fingers loosened on my lap. For the first time in far too long, I was moving towards somewhere instead of away from something, and it felt like breathing after holding my breath for years. The first morning in my new home, I woke to the sound of waves, not the crashing roar of storms, but a steady, breathing rhythm, in and out, as if the ocean itself was alive and keeping me company. I lay there for a while, eyes closed, letting that sound fill the spaces where old worries used to live. The cottage was small, but it fit me like a well-tailored coat. Whitewashed walls, wide windows that let in more light than I thought I deserved, and a terrace where I could see the shimmer of the sea if I leaned just far enough. Dorothy's sister Eleanor had stocked the fridge with fresh bread, butter, and a jar of honey from a local beekeeper. I made toast, poured coffee, and sat at the little kitchen table watching the steam curl up like a soft promise. The air smelled different here, salt, sun, and something green I couldn't name. Even the quiet was different. In the old house, quiet had been heavy, filled with absence. Here it felt like an open palm, inviting me to rest. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time. Books first. Always books first. As I lined them on the shelf, I caught myself smiling at the titles, old friends I'd carried through decades. Frank's copy of The Old Man and the Sea found its place in the centre. I could almost hear him chuckle at the irony. By afternoon, I was on the beach. I'd told myself I would just walk, but soon my shoes were in my hands, my feet sinking into the wet sand. The water lapped at my toes, cold and clean. I thought about all the times I'd stood on shorelines in the past, on hurried vacations with lists in my head and children pulling at my sleeve. This was different. I had nowhere else to be, no one tugging at my time. The sea stretched wide and endless, and for the first time I felt I had just as much space inside myself. In the evenings, I read on the terrace until the sky melted into colours I couldn't name. Dorothy would wander over with a bottle of wine, or Eleanor would bring a slice of lemon pie, just because. Sometimes we talked until the stars came out. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. I began to notice small changes, the way my shoulders no longer hunched, how I laughed without glancing around to see if it was appropriate, how I no longer rehearsed every word before I spoke. Here I wasn't mother or widow or retired librarian. I was simply Martha, and that was enough. The sea has a way of healing you without asking permission. One wave at a time, it carries away the silt and leaves you standing in clear water. I could feel it working on me already. I met Gordon on a Tuesday afternoon at the garden club Eleanor insisted I join. "You'll like him," she'd whispered, as if we were about to meet a famous actor. I didn't expect much. I was there for the plants, not for people. Gordon was tall with a careful way of moving, as if he was mindful of every step. His hair was silver, his hands sun-browned and lined. When Eleanor introduced us, he smiled with his whole face, the kind of smile that feels like sunlight after a cloudy morning. "So you're the new one by the sea," he said, not as a question, but as if he already knew my story. "Eleanor's told me you grow roses." I laughed softly. "I try to. In the old place, they bloomed in spite of me. Here, I'm starting fresh." He nodded, that slow, thoughtful nod of someone who listens more than they speak. Fresh starts are good for plants and for people. We ended up next to each other during the meeting, listening to a talk about soil composition. He made a few quiet, clever comments under his breath, not loud enough to be disruptive, just enough to make me smile. When it was over, he asked if I'd like to see his garden sometime. "Not to impress you," he added quickly, "just to share." That's how it began. No grand gestures, no undercurrents. Just two people who liked to walk among flowers and talk about things that had nothing to do with family dramas or the past. He showed me how to coax herbs to grow in salty air. I lent him a book about wild coastal plants. Sometimes we'd sit on my terrace with tea, looking out at the water, letting the pauses between words be as comfortable as the words themselves. What struck me most was that he never asked about my children, my past, my losses. He never pried. With Gordon, I wasn't someone to be pitied or fixed. I was simply worth spending time with. One afternoon, as we knelt side by side planting marigolds, he said, "You know, Martha, people sometimes think gardens are quiet, but they're full of conversation. It's just slower than ours." I smiled at the truth in that. Maybe that's why I liked being with him. He understood the language of patience. When he left that day, I realized something. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. I had people in my life now who wanted to be there, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And that, I thought, was a garden worth tending. It was a warm morning when the letter arrived, tucked among the usual stack of utility bills and advertisements. I almost missed it. Plain white envelope, my name written in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Then I saw the return address and my breath caught. It was from Lily, my granddaughter. I stood by the kitchen counter for a long moment, the kettle whistling faintly in the background. My hands weren't trembling exactly. More like holding a fragile bird I wasn't sure I had the right to touch. Slowly, I opened the envelope, unfolded the paper, and began to read. "Dear Grandma," it began. "I don't know if you'll even read this, but I have to write to you. I have to tell you that I understand now. I see how we treated you, how I treated you. I thought it was all jokes, harmless, but it wasn't. I see your face that day, and it makes my stomach hurt. I'm sorry. I am so, so sorry." The words blurred for a moment, and I realized my eyes were wet. But these weren't the hot, bitter tears I'd shed so many times before. This was something different. Softer, lighter. She went on. "Mum and Dad fight about you all the time now. They blame each other for what happened. But I've been thinking, maybe it's not about blame. Maybe it's about what we forgot. We forgot to be kind. I don't want to forget that anymore. I'm starting college this fall and I want to do better. I want to be better. If you ever want to talk, I would love that. If not, I'll understand. Love, Lily." I read it twice, 3 times. Each word felt like a pebble dropped into still water, sending out ripples I could feel in my chest. She was still so young, young enough to change, young enough to choose a different way. I carried the letter to the terrace and sat in the morning sun, the sea breeze playing with the edges of the paper. I could hear gulls somewhere in the distance. Dorothy came by unexpectedly and found me there, the letter in my lap. "What's that look on your face?" she asked. "It's a kind of miracle," I said softly. She sat down beside me, reading over my shoulder. When she finished, she nodded. She's got a good heart, that one. Maybe she just needed time to find it. For the rest of the day, I kept the letter close, not because it erased the past, it didn't, but because it showed me something I hadn't dared to believe. Sometimes, the seeds you plant do grow. It just takes longer than you think. I waited a week before I replied. Not because I didn't know what to say, I knew from the moment I read her letter, but because I wanted the words to settle inside me, to be sure I was speaking from a place that was calm, not raw. One evening, with the sound of waves drifting through the open window, I sat at my small desk, took out my nicest stationery, and began to write. "Dear Lily," I began, "your letter touched me more than I can say. It takes courage to look at yourself honestly and even more to admit you were wrong. I don't hold a grudge against you. You were young, and you followed the example of those you trusted. Yes, it hurt me, deeply, but I have always loved you. That love never left, even in silence." I paused, staring out at the fading light over the water. I could almost see her as a child, running through my garden, laughing, her hair tangled by the wind. I wrote on. "I want you to know you are welcome to visit me here. Not for an inheritance, not for anything material, just for tea, for conversation, for the sound of the sea in the background. I am not the same woman I was before. I cannot promise to be exactly the grandmother you remember, or perhaps the grandmother you wish I had been. But I can promise to be honest. We can begin again, if that's what you truly want." I told her about my new life. The garden, the library where I volunteered, the friends I'd made. I mentioned Gordon and Dorothy and the joy of simple afternoons by the ocean. I wanted her to see that life could be rebuilt, that broken things could be reshaped into something different, even if they never looked the same. "We don't need to talk about the past unless you want to," I wrote toward the end. "We can choose to build something new, something small but real. No expectations, no pretending, just the truth." I signed it with love, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it. On the walk to the post office the next morning, the sky was pale blue, the kind that makes you feel like the world is still full of possibilities. I didn't know if she'd take me up on the offer, if she'd ever make the trip down here. But as I slid the envelope into the slot, I felt lighter. It wasn't about getting her back. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about opening a door and letting her decide if she wanted to walk through. That morning, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and almost didn't recognize her. The woman looking back at me. Not because she was younger or because the years had suddenly erased themselves, but because her eyes were different. There was a steadiness there, a quiet certainty I hadn't seen in decades. For so long, my gaze had been that of someone waiting. Waiting for a call, waiting for an invitation, waiting to be seen. But now I was looking at someone who no longer stood in that endless line. I brushed my hair slowly, not because I was going anywhere special, but because I wanted to. I put on the soft blue sweater I'd bought at the little shop by the pier. The one Gordon said made my eyes look like the ocean at dusk. I made tea and took it to the terrace, where the roses were opening in the morning sun. Somewhere down the street, I could hear Dorothy laughing with Eleanor, their voices carrying like music. It struck me then. I wasn't living in someone else's shadow anymore. I wasn't the background in other people's stories. I was writing my own pages, Each day another line, another choice that belonged to me alone. The house by the sea was small, but it was mine. The friends I had were not bound to me by obligation, but by affection. Even the silences here felt like they belonged to me, rich and unhurried. I thought of Lily's letter, of the possibility that one day I might see her walking up the garden path. If she came, I would welcome her. If she didn't, I would still be here, still living, still smiling into the salt air. My happiness no longer depended on who stayed or who left. It was rooted deeper now, somewhere in the quiet part of me that had finally learned to breathe. The tea had grown cooler by the time I set the cup down. I went inside, caught sight of myself again in the hallway mirror, and this time I didn't look away. I studied every line, every crease, every mark the years had left. Not as flaws, but as proof. Proof that I had endured. Proof that I had begun again when it would have been easier to give in. I smiled then, not for the camera, not for anyone watching, but for myself. For the life that was mine now. And in that silent, honest moment, I knew the truth as clear as the sunlight streaming in through the window. I stopped waiting, and that's when my life finally arrived. What part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. If this story felt close to your heart, give it a like, subscribe if you want to be part of a space where real stories matter. Got a couple more minutes? Check out the next story. It's also about the things we rarely say out loud.